Yeah, well, there's the classic, isn't it? If you've got the A team with a B idea, that's the one you back. The A idea with a B team, don't go anywhere near them.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this Mishcon Academy session, part of a series of online events, videos and podcasts looking at the biggest issues facing society today. Just to introduce myself, I'm Chloe Sweden, a Senior Business Development Manager here at Mishcon, and I'll be hosting today's event. As we sit here in our Cambridge office, David needs no introduction around these parts, but I'll do my best to summarise his incredible career so far. David is an entrepreneur, investor, policy advisor, and thought leader who's played a transformative role in shaping Cambridge's innovation ecosystem. He's founded and supported more than 60 companies, including Abcam, Analysis, and the Raspberry Pi Foundation, as well as co-founding Cambridge Angels, Cambridge Wireless, and the Cambridge Network. Today, we'll be discussing his latest book, Serendipity, which explores the power of chance, connection, and community in driving innovation. We have just under an hour, so first I'd like to explore a little bit more about your remarkable career before we dive into the book itself and finish with some audience Q&A. So, hi David.
Hello, Chloe.
It's lovely having you. Before we get into the many companies, investments and initiatives that you've been part of, I'd like to go right back to the beginning, if I may. Was there something early on in your childhood or early career that set you on this path, do you think?
Oh, what a tricky question. I suppose I'd like to answer that with two things, if I may.
For sure.
Firstly, one of my earliest memories is I'm probably under 3 years old, I would guess, and in the back garden, and there's a worm, and I wondered what was inside the worm, so I picked it up and I bit it. And then some blood came out, and then I wondered if there was any more blood in the worm, so I then proceeded to bite the worm again until there was no more blood. And then it set me thinking about how worms worked and how they operated and so on. And the other one is nothing like as gruesome as that. It's much later. I read in a book about how to keep bees, and I got rather interested in the idea. And I'd already been keeping lizards and slow worms in the garden and in tepidariums and all sorts of weird things. But bees really fascinated me. But my parents wouldn't let me keep such dangerous animals in the garden. So I started a beekeeping club at school. And in the first year of properly keeping bees, I managed to generate enough honey to be able to sell to the parents who were willing to support it. And so I made all the money back that I'd actually spent on setting up the beekeeping club in the first place.
So it's sort of the combination between curiosity and entrepreneurialism early on, because you could have gone down the path of zoology, but you sort of, really thought about...
I nearly became a biologist, but I really did very badly at O-level biology. And I still don't understand why. And I think it was because deep down, I'm an engineer, and I think in systems terms. And the way biology was taught was basically you had to learn these facts and take it for granted about how stuff worked.
Yeah, super interesting. And part of what you've been able to do with that systems knowledge, I guess, is you've created what's been coined the Cambridge phenomena. In your view, as we sit here in our lovely Cambridge office, what is it about Cambridge in particular that makes it so good in terms of, fertile ground for innovation and curiosity?
Well, a Cambridge phenomenon was originally coined by somebody who had a chat with an FT journalist, and then it appeared in the FT. And then there was a company called Siegel Quince Wicksteed, who people may remember in the audience. And they wrote a book called The Cambridge Phenomenon. And then that appeared in the colour supplement of the Sunday Times. And I read the colour supplement of the Sunday Times and went, I really need to set up my company in Cambridge. I was already living in Cambridge, and I thought, this is fantastic. This is just a brilliant place. Look at what's going on here. And so that moment, which was probably the beginning of the 1980s, was the moment which I kind of clocked that something special was happening. And then during the late 1990s, meeting people like Herman Hauser and Alec Burrows, who was then the Vice Chancellor, and various other people, began to build up this network, which actually then turned into Cambridge Network and became, I suppose, a passion of mine for pretty well the last 25 years about how to connect people up.
And so, in terms of the Cambridge element, then, so you're saying that something already existed here. There was already this sort of like centrifugal force, but that actually you added to that and you leveraged that for.
Well, nobody, nobody, no matter how original they think they are, ever starts with completely blank slate, right? There is always stuff there, and Cambridge had already got some of the ingredients that make it special. I mean, if you look at the college system, and you look at its emphasis on, or the town's emphasis on science, and it was on technology and so on, there is a kind of social behavioral set of norms when you look at that, which tends to, certainly in the college system, the interdisciplinary thing. I had lunch in college today, and there was some people speaking Italian next to me, and there was a historian on the other side, and I was talking about telecommunications and politics across the way. So that kind of cross disciplinarity and meeting interesting and different people is part of that, and then you have this slightly slightly direct way of dealing with it being academic, of being scientific based, which means that you're not posturing quite so much, and that does actually lend itself to creating a kind of atmosphere in which you could actually see how the culture of Cambridge has developed from those kinds of roots. And there was a moment when, in late 1990s, when I went to Scientific Generics, who is a company down towards Melbourne, and I'd been invited, and I was a rival consultancy company, which I set up my consultancy company. I was a rival. And Richard King, of blessed memory, said, something has changed in Cambridge. You wouldn't have been invited to a party held by a rival consultancy company in the old days. Something has really shifted. And indeed, he was right. The Cambridge Network and all those kinds of organisations were beginning to build on those early bits and pieces and starting to think about, we still can compete, of course, but you also collaborate. And that foundation, I think, is very important for Cambridge's success over the last quarter century.
Talking of success, you have built and co-founded quite a lot of successful businesses, which is incredible to build one, let alone more than one in a lifetime. Abcam, Analysis, and many, many more. Is there one in particular that's your favourite child, shall we say?
You can't choose favourite children.
I often do.
I think you're allowed. I think I'm about to get grandchild number 11, and so
Wow.
maybe I'm allowed some favourites in amongst number 11 of them. But in the three kids I've got no favourites. So in the companies I've got, are there favourites? They all have their different qualities, as kids do, right? Analysis was very interesting because it was a way of building something that actually made a big difference to telecommunications in Europe and in the world, and changed a lot of telecommunications regulation and a lot of the environment that we saw that created that explosion in mobile communications and telecoms. We contributed quite a bit to that. So I'm quite proud of that as a thing. I think the Abcam one is really a superb example of how Cambridge works. When I had a department which was doing software and web development, and Jonathan Milner, who I sat next to by pure serendipity at a dinner, was complaining about antibodies, and I worked out the business plan at the dinner about how much it would cost to make the antibodies, which turned out to be correct within a few percent. And we worked, and by the following Saturday, he was in my office and we were putting that together. I think, that moment, which I can still replay, is one of the most interesting things. And we'll get to talk about the book a bit later, but that really, really does inform the book. That's how those things go on. But I've got stuff that I'm proud of now, which I've got I met a slightly interesting, shall we say, professor from Glasgow University. At least one of the people, by the expression on their face, knows this person in the audience. In the audience, knows this person. We've just raised 100 million, and we have a universal machine for making any molecule. Now, if you're not excited by the idea that you can have, you can now take a design of a molecule, we can work out how to make it, and then compile the code and program the machines and make the molecule without human intervention. And if you're not excited by that, and at the same time a bit scared, then I'll have a chat with you afterwards. But it really is exciting. It really is exciting. So, what am I most proud of? I don't know. Maybe I'm going to be most proud of the things that are to come, not the stuff now.
Yeah, good answer. We didn't talk about, though, Raspberry Pi, and actually sitting in that chair last week was Liz Upton,
Right.
talking about
Yep.
the work that she did and the incredible journey that she had and they had with the Raspberry Pi Foundation. Which you were instrumental in, when you first encountered Raspberry Pi, was there a kind of special source in the team or the technology or the mission that you knew that something great was going to come from it?
Well, there was Raspberry Pi. I need to explain how Raspberry Pi worked, right? There is the charitable foundation, and underneath it was this trading company with this very peculiar idea that you can make a small computer of about that kind of size and sell it for $35, and kids would then get hands-on experience and could wire this up into robots, and they could do different things and program the thing, and it wasn't precious in a box and far away from you. So it was basically Liz would have explained about overcoming the problem of training up computer scientists. And at the time that I joined, there was a handful, maybe 5 people or 6 people, doing the technical stuff. And there was this other small charitable thing which had a board of trustees and hardly anybody there that was that owned it 100%. And so first of all, they, as Sherry Kutu and I had a chat about it, and I said, well, if you're being asked to join the Raspberry Pi board, how many milliseconds did it take you to say yes? So Sherry, Herman, and I joined the board, and we sat around for a couple of meetings. But very quickly, one of the David Braben, who'd been very instrumental in getting the whole thing off the ground, took me out for a very nice Japanese meal at Japas, just around the corner here, and asked me if I'd like to be chairman of both the trading company and the foundation. So at that point, there were probably, I don't know, a dozen people in total in the organization. Yeah. And I said yes. I did think about it, but I did say yes. And then I put in place a rule which said that somebody doing a job like that must not stay for more than 6 years. So I gave myself 6 years to get the thing sorted and laid the foundation for the flotation and all those other bits and pieces and rework the governance structure and blah. Right, a lot of kind of stuff that lawyers enjoy, really.
Do they enjoy it? I don't know. They do it, but whether they enjoy that bit. So you've done lots of things. We talked about the sort of the board piece. We talked about the sort of the investor and the founder piece. You've also advised government on major national strategies. How different is influencing public policy from building companies and getting involved in the board like you were just talking about?
Look, working with government is completely different. And it's a source of frustration, of course, because if you're used to doing things in business and then trying to do things in government, and you don't recognise that you're dealing with a completely different system, you will get very frustrated. And I know a lot of people who've have found that. And to be honest, I found it fairly frustrating in a number of respects. But the thing is that the rules and incentives and what's being attempted to achieve in government are quite different from anything in the corporate world. And so, you'll get people people react to the environment in which they're in and the incentive structure and the other things around them, and then they'll do what's expected. And the civil service and business are utterly different in what they're trying to achieve. But I can give you some examples of my time at Ministry of Defence, or I mean, worked on the Ofcom, the original white paper for restructuring communications, which came out in 2003 and led to the formation of Ofcom, which was an interesting experience. And one of the things about that, for example, is that you do things and then you have no idea whether it's had any effect until you see some final product that's emerged at the other side. But I can talk about all of those things if you want, or we could get on with some other questions.
Well, I think it's interesting actually, because that's completely at odds with sort of the founder mentality, which is, absolutely immediate, isn't it? It's sort of like you do something and then the next day you know whether it's worked or not worked.
Yes, I mean, depends on the size of the company. I mean, so it's not quite as immediate as that, but there's an immediacy in accountability for the consequences of what you're doing. So when you're a founder or a chief exec or whatever, there are those consequences. I suppose, a perm sec would say the same thing, or a senior civil servant would say the same thing. If I make those decisions and I've got to do this stuff, then the consequences will come back to me. But they come back to you in a different way. In the business, you're rewarded for having taken the risk and having got something right, and people will forgive you in general if you've got it wrong. In the civil service, the punishment for getting things wrong is significantly greater, and that's an incentive structure that makes life. Once you understand it, you can work with it, but it gives you a very different way of behaving.
Yeah. So when we reflect on key turning points of your career, given that we're talking about serendipity today, how much would you attribute to plan and intention, and how much to serendipity?
Well, what would I say? I mean, the thing is that plan and intention has been there, and I think you need a strategy in the sense that you need to know roughly where you're going. And I, in my 20s, I had a 10-year view about what I wanted to do, and so that informed me, and I kept that up really in that sense. So trying to think slightly long term. But in the day-to-day, you don't know what's going to happen. So if you take Jonathan Milner and I sitting down at dinner by chance, nobody could have planned that. But the difference is, I suppose, whether you've got what Pastor called the prepared mind. You're interested in other people. You find out about what they're doing. You have a chat with them, and you have a prepared mind that looks and recognizes an opportunity when it presents itself, and then will do something about it, right? Not just go, oh, well, that was an interesting discussion, and then get on with something else. No, you've got to do something about it. So it's a mixed strategy in that sense. You can't steer your life and your career without having an overall picture about what you want to do. But on the other hand, all these micro events are really important and can take you over there rather than over there.
On the subject of serendipity, we're going to move to the book that you've just written. It feels like in this way the book is a reflection of your journey, but also a challenge to all of us to rethink how we approach chance and connection. So starting off with a really easy question, what inspired you to write Serendipity?
I was sitting in a parliamentary committee, which was actually reviewing the ARIA bill, and many of you will know about I can't really say it because the I in this word just pains me. It is the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, and I'm afraid that the word invention for me is a black and white film with a man with his hair on fire, wearing a tweed jacket, emerging from a shed holding a test tube, right? It is the kind of archetypal thing that I think is a problem for the United Kingdom, in the idea that somehow an invention is going to solve all our problems, right? So I decided, actually in that committee, I proposed a different name for ARIA, which the then opposition picked up and made an amendment to the bill to change the name of the agency. They didn't succeed, of course, but never mind. But during that conversation, I said, well, of course, serendipity doesn't happen by accident, right? And it got such a laugh around the table with the MPs sitting around. I thought, do you know what? That's a good title for a book. And maybe maybe that's what I ought to do. And it took me probably 3 years before I got round to actually. There's a wonderful thing where Peter Cook met somebody at a cocktail party and said, "What do you do?" And the chap said, "I'm writing a book." And Peter Cook said, "Neither am I." And I think that is exactly right. The state I was in for about 2 or 3 years, and then finally I got to the point where I was saying, "Look, I have to write this book," and then that's what I did.
Yeah, put the focus to it. Your book, I mean, it's a fantastic read, and obviously, hopefully, everybody will be picking up a copy. It opens with endorsements from an extraordinary gathering of thinkers. So you've got Stephen Fry, Reid Hoffman, Rory Sutherland, Lord Richard Wilson, to name a few, like dropping names there, like like I guess. It's one hell of a dinner party lineup, if I'm honest.
Yeah, pretty great dinner party.
For a bit of fun, A, can I come to that dinner party? But B, if you could pick one of them, if you were doing the table plan for that dinner party, who would you want to sit next to?
That's the favourite children question all over again. Everybody's different, aren't they? It depends what you're trying to achieve in the dinner party. And by the way, there are a number of women in there, like Diane Coyle and others that we need to mention as well, who who I would certainly invite to that dinner party. They have some great conversations. All of them are different. I suppose if you want wit and repartee, Stephen is probably that, right? And when I met him at college where I'm a fellow, Queen's, with Reid Hoffman, as it happens, so this is how Cambridge works, just how tight these networks actually operate. I explained to Stephen about the book I was writing, and he said, "Well, of course, Erasmus was here at Queen's, and have you read In Praise of Folly?" And I used quite a naughty word at that point, because I was trying to get the book out, and this was in February, and I was hoping to get published in May. But actually, he was right. It was one of those chance encounters, and the book actually picked up some of what Stephen said about In Praise of Folly, and I've read the book. He's a very witty guy, and his endorsement there, of course, is entirely his own and is the longest endorsement of the lot. But I mean, if you want to know about government, go to Richard Wilson, who I've known for ages and ages. I first met Richard back in the late 1980s, I think. I mean, he was cabinet secretary, and he came to be master of Emma and helped me with my Centre for Science and Policy, and we then led on to the Masters in Public Policy in the Bennett School and all those things. Terrific guy. I mean, Rory Sutherland, if you want to be able to turn a problem upside down and think about something in a completely different way, Rory's absolutely brilliant. I mean, all of them. Diane Coyle, if you want to know about, have some really big thinking about quality of life or economics or, trying to wrestle with some of the big problems that we've got, she's fantastic. I mean, all good.
Let's make that dinner party happen, and then you can move around and sit in different places. The book argues that many of the breakthroughs come from unexpected encounters structured through what you term as like deliberate network formation, like here in Cambridge, obviously. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see serendipity being engineered in this way?
So, look, the thing is that I don't know how many of you are chemists, but you mix two chemicals in a flask or a test tube, and there's a chemical reaction that goes on because the molecules are bumping into each other and they recombine and they do things. And you can speed that up immensely by putting in a catalyst. And everybody understands, I think, we always use the word catalyst for expressing this particular phenomenon. Well, what's actually happening is that catalyst is enabling the molecules to find each other so that they can actually react. It's the same thing in these encounters between people. You need to put the structures in place so you increase the chances, because what's going on in this solution is not that the molecules somehow, have some tube map that they're following and they're going to meet the other molecule on the other side. No, it's all random. It's all random movement. We're all subject to that kind of random movement. But if you make it more likely that you're going to encounter somebody, then it increases the chances of something interesting or useful happening. And that's what I mean by engineering serendipity. You can't be certain, so there's no certainty in the civil service terms of nothing is going to fail, but it's not entirely random in the sense that it's a very low probability event. You can change the odds.
And you mentioned the civil service there. I quite like, on the flip side, that you say in the book, if I was to design a system with the explicit purpose of suppressing serendipity, it would look remarkably like the modern government bureaucracy. And it actually makes me think not just about government, but large corporations. And, we, as a law firm, we are a large corporation across many different offices. You talk about kind of being less as engines of problem solving and more as machines for the avoidance of visible failure.
Yes.
Which I love. Yes. I love that.
Yeah, that's right.
So thinking about not just government departments, but also how corporations like Mishcon and others can sort of, not suppress serendipity.
Well, but see, the thing is that I mean, there's first of all, there's a surface area of interaction, right? A mouse has far less body mass compared to its surface area than an elephant, right? So they behave completely differently, and they have different lifespans, and everything about them is different. And so the same thing is with organizations. If you have a big organization, you have to hold the thing together. You can't afford to take a risk that is going to demolish the entire organization. So risk avoidance becomes much more important. And the entire culture within the organization then starts to shift away from experimentation and risk-taking into the kind of things that you see. And it's a natural thing. It's at a fairly extreme end with the civil service and government, because they have added problems. They imagine what the headlines would look like in some of the well-known newspapers. So that is also something which comes into play. So you can explain it. So what do you do to change it? Well, I quote in the book, I'm going to go off a slight tangent here, but you'll see why I'm doing it in a second. There's a chap called Clayton Christensen who wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, which was all about why large companies fail. And my favorite example is about steam shovels. Now, steam shovels were the original excavators for digging big mines and doing these big things. And they had steel horses. And originally they were steam engines, and then they became diesel engines, and very complicated big machines. And the business model for selling them was very complicated, and maintaining them was difficult. In 1948, a small company in the Midlands took the hydraulic technology that had been used in the Second World War for aircraft and decided they could use it for making actuators that would then actually enable you to dig and excavate. Of course, these were tiny things. They were nothing like the capability of the big steam shovels. But has anybody in this audience really ever seen a steam shovel? Probably not. Everybody thinks of these things as these hydraulic excavators. They took over. How quickly did they take over? Within 20 years, 22 out of the 24 steam shovel companies in the world had gone bust. The only two that survived were the two that set up completely separate entities that were independent of the corporate culture, that were independent of the business model, and operated entirely at arm's length. And those were the ones that survived and are now producing the hydraulic shovels. Now, I don't suppose Mishcon or any other, or even a government, is going to do exactly that. They're not going to do something as radical. But you do need to give people a safe space away from that corporate culture. And the other bit that's really important, and I was talking to another legal firm about this very point, is mixing. You've got to take somebody out of, if they're doing construction law, go and stick them into work in a team that's doing biotech. Yep. And do some mixing across the place so that you don't allow people to sink into, well, not sink into, because you're not going to sink into anything, but just be too narrow in the way you're thinking about problems. Very long answer, I'm afraid.
No, but fascinating one, so thank you. You also reference how technology has made it easier than ever to connect. I think we can all agree that we're more connected than ever, but maybe perhaps harder to have genuine serendipitous moments. How do you see that balance playing out?
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently, actually, because there's a couple of things, well, there's at least three things going on. Firstly, you might rely on technology to direct you to certain things, right? And so you are, unless the technology is actively suggesting stuff at random to you, you tend to get narrowed down.
Yep.
The second one is that we are somewhat overwhelmed by the amount of information that we have to deal with. You know, as a kid, I remember going along, I mentioned this in the book, you know, I'd go to a library and you would actually spend quite a lot of time looking at books, one of which turned out to be really interesting, and then you would read it and you'd come across it by chance. But the amount of information that you had to deal with was relatively limited. And the other one is that the speed with which you then deal with things and don't have the prepared mind to recognize an opportunity that's coming along. For example, I met some people last night in London, and perhaps 30 years ago, that encounter would have been a bit more important because and I would have done something with it. And the encounter was enabled partly as a result of technology. So there's a whole series of things going on here. Nothing is ever straightforward, because the technology can deliver some amazing insights and give you stuff at random and do things for you. And I'm sure it's not just that I'm getting old, although I am, and I'm not just getting less capable of dealing with the information load. There is something in there that does concern me. And the bit that I just want to give a tag perhaps to another question, I don't know, but for Cambridge, as Cambridge scales up, it's got the mouse to the elephant transition problem itself, which is, and being overwhelmed by all these opportunities. How do you actually make sense of it so you can direct that energy so you create meaningful things that are going to happen rather than just chance events that fizzle out?
Yeah, we talk all the time about, at Mishcon, making meaningful connections, so that makes complete sense. I'd like to spend some time with some audience questions. So I've just one more from me, and then we'll open it up to both online and also in the room. Looking to the future with your crystal ball, where do you see the next wave of serendipitous innovation coming from? And you can't just say Cambridge. Like, in general, where do we think?
You don't mean geographical
I don't mean
location.
geographically. I mean sort of, conceptually.
Conceptually, I think, firstly, there's a lot to do in building design and environment design. Okay, if you look, I spent quite a lot of time with Trinity when they were designing the Bradfield Centre. And if you walk into the Bradfield Centre, you'll see that that's actually designed in a really good way. It encourages serendipity. So I think there's a lot to do in that. And I was actually given a tour with AstraZeneca with Lee Cronin, my interesting professor from Glasgow. We went round for a rather high-level tour at AstraZeneca on Friday, and I'd say AstraZeneca have designed their building in a way that really does promote serendipity. I mean, and we talked about how they were doing it. So I think there's a lot to be done in building and environmental design. Secondly, I think there's a lot to be done in the kind of encouraging people to. I talked about jumping into different disciplines within companies or so on. I set up the Centre for Science and Policy here in Cambridge, which takes policymakers from Whitehall and introduces them to 30 really interesting people they chat to for an hour. And the 14,000 meetings have now taken place between the Whitehall people and the people in Cambridge. And I would say there's no surprise that Cambridge has gone steadily up the government's agenda, because basically all the civil servants are now talking about this all have had first-hand experience of Cambridge, and Cambridge is part of their network, right? So think about that. Think about how you do that constructive networking. So there's the building, there's the environment, and then there is the reward structure, right? Which is how do you actually encourage that behaviour and make it not just something that I might like to do because I like a glass of red wine and chatting to people because I'm pretty garrulous. But how do you encourage people to do that and get rewarded for it? And how do you engineer it in that way? And perhaps provide role models so people can see how that works. So there's a number of other things that you can do, but those are the kind of principal things that I would say.
Great, fantastic. And I think building design is an interesting one because I was sat by the kitchen today and had lots of people pass me and lots of people talking about the questions that they were going to ask you. So serendipity by design because I couldn't get a seat in the regular part of the office. So I'm going to open it up to questions in the room. Anybody? I know it's always hard doing the first question. Chris Keane has a question right at the front.
I always forget that this involves a microphone. David, thank you so much for being here. That was fascinating. We've known one another for quite a long time, which makes me moderately comfortable being a devil's advocate, and I am doing this firmly tongue-in-cheek. If someone were listening to this session and read your book and said, it's a lot easier for serendipity to happen to David Cleevely than it is to me, how would you respond to that, and how would you encourage them to step out of that mindset and embrace the opportunities that you're talking about?
So I'm a great Jane Austen fan, and there's a section in Pride and Prejudice, or there's a bit in Pride and Prejudice, where Elizabeth is sitting at the piano, and I forgot what Colonel whatever his name is with her, and Darcy comes across. And there's a bit of a dialogue in which Elizabeth upbraids Darcy via the Colonel, as it were, to say, look, what do you think of this man? He would not dance at the ball, even though there were many ladies in want of a partner. And Darcy says, in a kind of he's beginning to warm up in the book as a not quite such a haughty character, and he says, well, I don't find it quite so easy to chat to people in company, and I'm not as social as others. And Jane replies, not Jane, Elizabeth sitting at the piano. Elizabeth says, well, I don't play the piano as well as I would like, but I blame it on want of practice. And I think there is an element of that. Okay, so we all know piano players who are much better than others, but you can improve your piano playing. And you can do that. And there's a theory that if you put 10,000 hours in, you can get grade 8 or whatever the number is. I think the same applies with this stuff. And I think, going back to my point about incentives, you should reward people for making a bit of an effort to do this. So Pride and Prejudice is my answer.
I love it. That took me by surprise.
So that was really interesting. I think for me, being probably a younger professional in the room, and I think there's a few other people I can see around us that would also benefit from this, is sort of advice that you'd give to your younger self as well. So more about like making meaningful connections with people. How do you do that? Sort of maybe a bit of advice you'd give to your younger self potentially, with approaching sort of networking and things like that.
Yeah, it's hard to say this because, probably I'm coming across as a very open and person who will talk to anybody. But if you'd seen me in my early 20s, you wouldn't have thought that. I was fairly, not exactly withdrawn. I mean, I did like to talk to people and was interested in them. But it took some effort by me, and I would say have more confidence in just opening conversations and finding out about people. And the other one is, this is a long-run investment. You should be doing things for other people, contributing to the network, because although it's not a transaction, there is something about the general way in which the network in which you're then a member then delivers back to you as much, if not more, than you put in. But there's no direct relationship there. It isn't that I can say, I'll do this for you if you do that for me. That is not what I'm saying. I'm saying you do stuff at random. I had a conversation with a young person from Hong Kong today, about an hour and a half before we came out. I spent 3/4 of an hour with them because, in fact, it was Diane Coyle who asked me to have a chat with them, right? Because she thought this particular person was worth talking to. And I gave them some advice. There's nothing I'm going to get back from that. And yet, I know, as I said to her, that at some point, I'm sure something will come back as a result of that networking and so on. What you're as a young person, God, I really feel old at this point. As a young person, you don't see that because you don't see the decades of how that builds up and how that then creates that kind of network in which you work. So I would say try and do those things, and you'll see that actually it makes your life and everybody else's life much better.
Brilliant. And then just focusing a bit more maybe on the point that I just said around when you were like younger, things that you'd wish you'd done more of potentially. Was it maybe more of the doing things that is sort of you're not giving back as much, or is you're focusing on something that's, you know, just for the greater good instead of just helping your own self? Or is that something you did already when you were younger and there was something else that you'd rather do?
Eating less worms?
Yeah, so somebody, look, yes, you can always do that. There was a John Finnemore sketch in which the sirens were the worst possible sirens because they told you what would have happened if you'd done something differently in your past, which is, you know, the thing you really don't want to know. Okay, and John Finnemore was an excellent comedian from that point of view, very, very clever guy. But the thing is that somebody once said to me, you always do the best you can because otherwise you would have done something else. And there's that, just don't, any hints that you want to rewind the tape and think, well, I could have done something differently. Well, I was what I was at the time, and those were the circumstances, and that's what I was. So would I have really done anything different? It wouldn't have been feasible. It's one of these. It's a bit like thinking about quantum mechanics. You know, would it really have gone a different way? I don't know. I mean, there are things that, you know. There's obviously the experiment. Would I go back and tell my younger self a few things? Of course I would, about some of the decisions, particularly some of the investments I've made. You know, or you know, stuff where I thought I should have done that, and I really should have done it, but I didn't do it. But I'm not sure. Sorry, there's a long pause there. Obviously, yes. I think I should have been more organised. I should have been more rational in some of the things that I did. But then, would I have been who I am if I'd been like that? Well, I wouldn't. So it doesn't work.
Fab. Yeah, thank you.
2 more questions.
It's a deep philosophical question, that.
I'm going to ask you a really practical question then. With your investor hat on, what would you say when you see a board or a concept or basically the personalities that come to you for that investment? Is there a personal quality that you've seen in very successful founders that you would say, yeah, I will back you?
Okay, so I often say, you know, back Jonathan Milner because he could walk through walls, right? And that's very important. But then we've probably all encountered people who would walk through walls, but after you've told them that walking through that wall was probably not the best thing to do, and they still did it. So really the quality is you have a discussion with them, and what emerges is better than either of you had thought of in the first place. And that's the most important thing.
So an openness is...
Yeah, willingness to you've got to listen to the other person. I once met the head of the Swiss Armed Forces, a very formidable lady, who said, you have to get people through 4 stages, which is I hear you, I hear you, I understand you, hear you, understand you, agree with you, hear you, understand you, agree with you, and I will do what you say. And the same kind of thing happens in doing business and investment. You have to get three people through a lot of stages about of understanding each other. And if the other person is so fixed that they're going to walk through that wall, as opposed to let's have a chat about which wall it might be best to walk through, they're probably not as investable as somebody who will, you'll have that discussion, you'll get all the way through, you've appreciated each other's points of view, you've created something better, and then you've both decided that that is the wall that you should walk through. Okay.
I've always found that teachability thing with founders an interesting dichotomy, though, because founders sort of like by their very nature want to go after a problem and, you know, and want to run through walls. And then that kind of teachability piece sort of doesn't always fit with the kind of personality type.
So you probably get a clue about my own personality. The word teachability kind of doesn't quite work with me because it implies that somehow I'm I'm telling somebody something, they're a pupil and they're not as clever or they're not as well informed as me, and that is wrong, because the people who are founders will have knowledge that I haven't had. They'll have a view of the world that is completely different to mine, and so it's not teachability. It's both parties have to learn from each other in order to get to a synthesis, and that's what makes people investable, because you know this is a journey. It's not just I've got this perfectly formed business plan and okay, we'll all agree and we'll walk through that wall. No, there are going to be several walls you're going to need to walk through, and you don't know where they're going to be and what you're going to need to be able to do to get through them, and that's going to be a co-creation, and that co-creation isn't the relationship between a teacher and a pupil.
Yeah, it's between two equals. I think we had another question.
Hi. Hello, David. You mentioned about the dangers and the benefits of technology, and I'm curious, as a writer, how you feel about aspiring writers using generative AI to assist and sometimes even to write their work for them.
I should quote the end of the book.
I did see a little bit about it
The
in the
end of
book,
the
but I'm
book.
saving myself.
It says, finally, ChatGPT and Claude, both occasionally wrong and sometimes irritating, helped me think more clearly, broaden what I could cover, and forced me to write better. So I wrote that very deliberately because it is actually a message to writers. It is saying, don't use these things as substitute for your writing, but they can really improve what you're doing, and they can, you can ask questions which will take you in places you hadn't thought of. The writing has to be your own, and I think that there's a great deal that you can do with these bots. On the other hand, you have to recognise that I've worked with LLMs of different kinds now for a long time, and I use them fairly, I mean, probably 2-3 hours a day, I would guess, something like that. I mean, when I'm working on stuff. It's like working with somebody else. You begin to appreciate what their limitations are, what their strengths are, and play to those strengths and use those. Don't use them as a substitute for a human being, because they're not.
Thank you very much. I would be really interested to know from your perspective how you weigh up the balance between investing in an idea and investing in people, because as advisors, we see founders come to us with what is objectively a dreadful idea, but we would back them to the ends of the earth because they are fantastic people, and vice versa. And so I'd be really interested to see how you navigated that from an investing perspective.
Yeah, well, there's the classic, isn't it? If you've got the A team with a B idea, that's the one you back. The A idea with a B team, don't go anywhere near them, right? So that's the way to think about it. I mean, what you're buying into is optionality, isn't it? I mean, the thing is that you know that the future isn't going to be as everybody planned it. So I've mentioned, the nice shiny business plan before. It's nothing, it's a famous thing. None of these plans survive contact with the enemy, right? So what you want is the people who you know are going to be able to cope with the things that are going to be unexpected, that nobody was going to foresee, and yet we're going to be able to cope with it and create something out of it. And that's what you're really investing. You're investing in the team because you're investing in the options they're going to be able to create in the future for exploiting something. That's to say that you can have a great team, but they can have such a bad idea that you don't want to invest in them. So it's not quite as straightforward as that.
Great. Unless there are any more questions, we could keep going. Is there? Oh, sorry, Khan.
I met Khan on the way in, and he promised he was going to ask a question. So
There you go. Man of his word.
So I guess something that first-time founders struggle with is, do you start the company and then think about what you're going to do, or do you have an idea and then act upon it? Does the company come first, or does the idea come first?
the idea comes first, in the sense that you have something that you're passionate about, right? So let's go to AbCap, for example, right? Jonathan, over dinner, I remember getting really animated about the problem with antibodies. And for a researcher, using an antibody that was the wrong antibody, or that it didn't work in the experiment, meant that you lost weeks of effort, and it was an absolute disaster. And he was utterly passionate about trying to solve that problem, right? Now, exactly how you do that, how that turns into a company and what you do, is then the second thing. It's a bit like Simon Sinek's thing, let's get the vision right, then let's get the how are we going to achieve that vision, and then what you do, which is the company and the business plan and the other things, follow on from that, right? So get that hierarchy correct. So yeah, creating a company and designing all those bits and pieces, actually you're probably making a terrible mistake, because you've got to get that vision thing right first. Got to get it really clear about what's the general thing what are you really trying to achieve, and then the mechanism for doing it will follow.
Thanks, David. Going back to teachability, and I'm thinking about the comments you made at the beginning of the session about the way you were taught for exams and for your O-levels. Is there more we could be doing, not at the sort of tertiary and postgraduate education level to share knowledge, but to teach in primary and secondary levels how to think like an entrepreneur, how to break molds, so that we can compete as a society on a global level rather than just a local level?
Yeah, it's a very important question, a very important point. The stuff that kids do, as I've mentioned, I've got grandchildren now, and I enjoy really teaching them things, but getting them to experiment and do some really wild stuff that makes their parents nervous. But I did the same thing with their parents, and they, didn't have anybody looking over my shoulder, well, apart from my wife, about that kind of thing. So there's that experimentation thing, which I think is very important. The other, and not trying to rote learn and put things, that is not equipping people for a future. The other one about the entrepreneurial stuff, in thinking about it and about my own kids, they've all gone on to do entrepreneurial things. And when I look at what they were doing in their, late primary school and into their teenage years, give an example, Adam, my eldest, right? At the end of primary school, they had a fair and they were going to sell products. And he had the idea for doing teacher top trumps. So we then, the technology now would allow you to manufacture these cards really easily, but it was quite difficult at the time. So we manufactured packs of teacher top trumps. And he borrowed money from the primary school in order to be able to fund the materials that he needed to make these cards. And it was the only time, the first time that anybody had gone to the school as a primary school to then say, I want to borrow, I don't remember what the amount was, but it was something like £40 or something. And all the cards sold out. So in terms of what that imprinted in him, because kids at the age of 10 or 11 are very susceptible to this kind of thing, actually he thinks much more as do all my kids. I could give examples for Matthew and Olivia. So I firmly believe that that's the case, and you need a broad education system that allows for that experimentation and for doing different things in order to encourage it. So yes, is the short answer.
Right, unless there's any more burning questions, I feel like we're going to keep saying this and we'll be here all evening. Thank you very much for everybody in the room. Please join me in thanking our guest today, David Cleevely, CBE, to give you your full title. Thank you, David, for insightful and inspiring conversation. Serendipity is out now in all good bookshops and
Well,
online.
Not really, not very good bookshops, I'm afraid.
Okay.
But very definitely online. And if you like it, please leave a review.
Out now in average bookshops and online. I encourage everyone to read it. And you never know what might come of your next fortuitous connection. So thank you, and join me in thanking David.
Thank you very much.